Welcome to Voices in Health and Wellness. This is the show where we bring together forward-thinking practitioners, innovators and educators who are reshaping care delivery across every corner of the health and wellness landscape. Today I'm joined by someone whose journey truly cuts across medicine, law, education and systems reform, Dr. Chereka Kluttz. Jarika is a board-certified family physician with over a decade of experience, including 7+ years in emergency medicine. She's also an attorney with a JD earned during the pandemic, driven by her desire to rewrite the narrative of a broken healthcare system. Today, she operates at the unique intersection of clinical care, regulatory consulting, and policy advocacy, working to protect provider integrity whilst enhancing the patient experience, whether it's freelance regulatory writing, telehealth, or guest lecturing future clinicians. Jarika brings bold compassion and strategic insight to everything she does. So with that, Jarika, I'd like to welcome you to the show and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So you've had a very interesting journey and a very interesting career. Can you talk us through it a little bit? How you moved from family medicine and emergency care to now holding both a DO and a JD?
Yeah, it's been an interesting path. When I was a resident, I always kind of knew that I was going to work in the emergency room. I trained at a small community hospital, and I loved working at the emergency room there. And most of the physicians there were family medicine or internal medicine boarded. So that was always kind of the idea for the path. And of course, when I finished residency, I kind of jumped right into it. And it wasn't until I'm working full-time nights in the ER that I started to really feel as an attending the disparities that we typically see that patients deal with in healthcare. And one of the things that was very frustrating to me was not being able to have meaningful input other than, what most of us do, which is send an email or send a memo and try to get clarity on new policies and such. And so fortunately, along my training, I was able to meet up with another physician who had actually relocated to the city I lived in for the part-time evening program for her law degree. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is fascinating. This is crazy. Can I do this? Because I'm working full-time in the ED. And I did it. I was like, you know what, I'm going to go for it. I applied to one school, got in, and I'm like, must be my path. And so doing that part-time ER full-time was a wild ride over 4 years, and finishing literally in May of 2020. So 2 months after the world shut down for the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the ER was pretty much booming at that point because that was one of the only places that was open for patients to be able to access care, just because of how scary things were. And then, of course, coming through the pandemic, that in turn led to some other interests that I developed because I realized, I'm like, man, even doing this in the ER, I'm glad that I can be here to help patients, but I just felt like there was so much more I could be doing. And so literally while I was in the midst of doing that, not really doing much with the law degree at that point, I was approached by a company who was kind of paying attention to the work I was doing in the ER and paying attention to the fact that I was fired up and trying to fix things. And so they asked me to be a local medical director for a clinic, and they had never had one before. So that was kind of my first, attending level segue into leadership. And after doing that for a year, they were like, well, hey, let's do this on a bigger scale, across the country in a different city with 9 clinics instead of 1. And so there I went. And so it's been kind of like this ever evolving process. And as I moved up the, medical corporate ladder, if you will, I started to really see even more frustration because I thought I was positioning myself to truly make an impact. And then what ended up happening was I ended up working with a lot of individuals who were very passionate about, making meaningful change. But because of the corporate machine and because of insurance restrictions, we just couldn't move things forward, which was, as a physician, when you're really trying to make meaningful change, that's, very disheartening. And so that's when I honestly decided to, start independent consulting. And it just kind of, my career's kind of taken off from there. And so now I have the opportunity to work with different organizations, law firms, healthcare startups, and I'm able to, provide some meaningful influence on their policy development and their workflows and work in a way that we protect first and foremost, the safety of our patients, but also protect the integrity of the field and protect the integrity of what we do.
Amazing. So was there a breaking point that made you realize you needed tools beyond the clinical to drive change? Was it something that happened in the pandemic, or was there a specific thing that kind of flipped the switch?
It was probably a lot of little things along the way. And then the pandemic, of course, for a lot of us really kind of set things in motion. And unfortunately, like I said, since I was in the ER, I didn't really have a chance to do that. So once I got into the leadership position that I was in, that was honestly my breaking point, if you will, because I was so ready and so hungry for, really making a good impact on healthcare. And you end up getting to a point where you're having meetings with all of your C-suite individuals, and the agenda doesn't change in 6 months, 8 months. Nothing changes, nothing moves, nothing evolves, nothing develops. And if you become the squeaky wheel in those environments and start, challenging perspectives and challenging the system, change makes people uncomfortable, especially when, the powers that be that ultimately run these organizations, want to make sure that profit is ahead of, our care in a lot of ways. And so that was my breaking point. That is when I decided, if I got to walk away from everything that I've worked for, from all these positions that I had worked up to, I'm going to do that, because this is why I went to medical school. This is why I went to law school. I'm not being able to effectuate change in the way that I thought that I would be able to. So that's when I made the shift.
Thank you for that. Really, really helpful. And how specifically has the law degree helped you with your kind of ambition and what you're doing? How does it kind of link in?
Absolutely. So, the main benefit that I notice is being able to speak different business languages, if you will. I grew up in a medical household. Mom's a doc, mom's a nurse, dad's a doc. And so, I grew up speaking medicine, even before I really knew what medicine was. And so when you actually start practicing, sometimes that regulatory compliance, legal language, it feels very, very uncomfortable when you don't understand what it means. And you want to be able to talk to your leaders in your organizations and express how you feel. But there is a feeling for me of inadequacy, because I felt like I knew I didn't understand that half of things. And so that is why I pursued that. And after coming through the law program, by which, I ended up getting a health law concentration in addition to finishing my JD, that was kind of the focus. And that's where it's helped me the most. And so when we're looking at drafting policies, or looking at clinical workflows, or looking at patient outcomes, I am able to have that clinical eye, because I'm in the trenches still providing care to patients. But I can also have meaningful conversations with the business side of the organization, with the operations team, and honestly, correspond with their legal team, and really understand what's happening on that side, and then be able to mesh the two, because I can see through both lenses, and I can see, a little bit of, or I can see a little bit of what either side is missing. The regulatory, legal, business piece, they don't always understand the clinical side, and vice versa. So it allows me to kind of to look through both lenses and come to outcomes and solutions that are going to be beneficial for both sides.
Really interesting. So that's obviously giving you the ability to connect at a different level, because you have to understand these nuances and you can communicate with these other people other than medics. What do you think has been the biggest disconnect between medics and other people involved in healthcare from your perspective? Now that you've got these other tools, what do you see as the biggest gaps?
Honestly, the biggest gaps that I see, as far as, dealing with the medical professionals that I work with, is the fact that there's quite a few that don't understand why things can't be fixed quickly in some instances, or why some solutions are not viable or feasible within the context of an organization or a healthcare system. And that's because as clinicians, we're trained to fix the issue. There's an issue. Why can't we fix it? The solution seems like it should be simple. And that's exactly how I felt, at several points in my career. But I see that disconnect now that I have a greater and a deeper understanding of the regulatory side of things, because I understand, okay, if we're going to build world-class systems, we really need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that protects the integrity of what we do, that protects the safety of our patients, but that also follows all of the compliance and rules so that healthcare organizations don't, get into trouble and really don't miss anything critical, which is the main reason why those regulations are in place. So.
Thank you. So what does your day-to-day look like at the moment? I mean, how are you balancing consulting and telehealth and ER shifts and the clinical work that you do? It sounds like a pretty big portfolio.
It is, and this is, it's probably the question I get asked the most. I am, fortunately, I'm one of the individuals that likes a varied schedule, and I like change. And so my schedule kind of varies, but for the most part, I work from home doing telehealth and the consulting part of it. And then when it comes to the ER, I usually work, I still want to stay clinically active because I genuinely love what I do. And, I think when you're an ER physician, for a lot of us, we're just lifers. We want to go back, we want to stay, we want to, see our ER family, and we want to take care of our patients. So I do that, anywhere from 3 to 6 days a month, just kind of depending on the month and what's, what my other schedules look like. And then the rest of the time, I have scheduled days where, I'm doing telehealth and consulting, and I have scheduled days where, I'm just doing follow-ups and other networking and connections, like, when you and I got a chance to connect, a while back. So it definitely varies from week to week. And I love the flexibility because it gives me an opportunity to give back in other ways outside of just what I contribute with my job, because I do, medical mission work and things like that as well. So I like being able to have that flexibility where if I have a trip that I want to go on, or if I want to participate with something in my church, for example, I can very easily adjust. So it's busy, but it's interesting and it's very fun.
Sounds fascinating. I mean, having that sort of portfolio where you can wear so many different hats sounds really, really interesting. So you're obviously working in regulatory writing, patient education and policy. Who are you kind of primarily serving in those roles at the moment? And what kind of problems are you helping to solve?
Absolutely. So primarily I'm serving, healthcare startups and telehealth organizations primarily. And what I typically do in those spaces is we look at where the clinical gaps are and what the regulations say, we should be doing in order to mitigate risk and in order to address those gaps. And then because I've actually worked, in the trenches, so to speak, in the clinical space, I can then say, okay, the regulations want us to do it this way, but realistically and practically speaking, we know that this is actually how it works in real time. So let's figure out a way to kind of mesh that so that we're compliant, but we're also not losing any quality of care that we're providing for our patients. And so that's typically what the I guess, to simply put, the basis of kind of what we do. And that comes from policy drafting. If we need a protocol for something, I can help the regulatory team draft policies, or I'll put a clinical eye on some of the policies because they, regulatory team and compliance people have a very technical, difficult job. And a lot of times, once they've drafted this beautiful piece of work, it's always nice to have the clinical input to say, okay, yeah, this looks like this is checking a lot of regulatory boxes, but clinically this is not feasible, and here's why. And so that's, I get to kind of be a liaison for that. And that's kind of the basis of the work that I provide. And I do it in other spaces. Like you mentioned, I draft patient education pieces. I draft provider training pieces. If there's any kind of knowledge gap that we're starting to see in, auditing cases and looking at outcomes, patient outcomes, then we address that head on. And we're like, hey, what do the providers need? I do one-on-one meetings with our providers as well, just so that I can get a sense for what they feel is missing or what they feel that they need the most help with. And I make sure to bridge that gap between the provider and the organization. So serving as a consultant and as a medical advisor kind of allows me to kind of enter into several of these spaces and just make sure that all of the pieces connect and all of the policies are drafted and solid.
So is there any parts of the healthcare system that you find particularly frustrating or limiting right now? And maybe that's been shaped by you having two hats on. Obviously, you've always got your clinician at heart, but with these other hats on, just curious to know what you find most frustrating at the moment.
One of the things I think that is the most frustrating for me is wanting to fix it right away. Especially coming from the ER, we are kind of trained to identify the problem and fix it quickly. That's how we're wired. And, when you're working in different healthcare spaces, especially in policy drafting and regulatory writing and things like that, it's that those things don't move as quickly as we would like for them to. And so that's definitely a frustration that I have to kind of juggle and understand. And I will say, after having gone to law school and after, working in, this part of the healthcare space, I definitely developed a tremendous more amount of respect for the attorneys and the compliance folks that are working hard to kind of keep healthcare organizations in track. But even with that being said, it's still a challenge for me to really, propose changes. Hey, let's do this. Hey, let's execute. But then there's still other operational things and business things that have to be done and boxes that have to be ticked. And so, just trying to be patient with the process, I think is one of my biggest challenges that I face.
So if I was to give you a magic wand and you could change one aspect of healthcare immediately and quickly, because I know you mentioned that time was a big thing and it's frustrating how long things take, what would that thing be?
The top thing I would fix is healthcare for everybody. Healthcare for everybody. And I would also add to that, getting rid of a lot of the red tape that we have to jump through as providers, even when patients have access to care and they have insurance. Then insurance, of course, is an entirely different beast that, could be, a whole thing in and of itself. And so if I could wave a magic wand, I would get rid of, all of the insurance hurdles that slow down care and make care make care accessible for everybody.
Oh, so wonderful aspirations. I mean, how now you've got these both hats on and you've experienced in both sides of the equation. How would you do that? What will be your grand plan? Do you have any ideas? You must have thought about it.
I have thought about it for a while, and a lot of what I would propose is rooted in the fact that we think that limiting access for some people doesn't affect the system. It's like, well, they can't access the care, so how does that affect the system? Because people will be seen regardless. And there's this wonderful little rule here in the US called EMTALA that requires us to give everyone a medical screening exam when they come to the emergency room. And a lot of times that is where I saw the most disparity, is patients coming to the emergency room because they did not have care accessible outside of the emergency room, whether it was no insurance or insurance wouldn't cover, or whatever the case was. And so I think that would be one of my starting points, which of course is going to be so much easier said than done. But one of my starting points would be to figure out a way to make healthcare universal, as it works well, in other places outside the US, just so that we can at least make sure that access is there and that we're using our resources appropriately. Because, for example, if a young mother doesn't have insurance for herself or for her children, it's astronomically more expensive for her to come to the ER for them to be treated for ear infections or strep throat than it is for them to see their primary doctor. And the other part of that is that if they don't have insurance and don't have the means, they're not paying the hospital bill anyway. So the hospital's eating the cost, and it drives healthcare costs up for everyone else. And so, those are the things that kind of drive, the brokenness in the system. So, that's, not to put, too much detail into it, but that would be, kind of a starting point. We have some systems like that in place with, Medicaid and Medicare and things like that. But I think a more global reach, where healthcare was an even footing for everybody, would be so much more feasible and make quality healthcare so much more accessible. Fixing healthcare kind of start with understanding where a lot of the gaps are and understanding what part of the healthcare system is eating those costs when we don't have, equal access for everyone that's here. So, for example, if patients don't have access to care, they don't have insurance, they don't have, primary care physicians or anybody that's close to them, a lot of times they end up at the doorstep of the emergency room, and we end up seeing them. And if they don't have insurance or they don't have the funds, then they don't pay those bills, and the hospital eats the cost. And so that's, those are the things that silently in the background drive up healthcare cost and really make the system even tougher to navigate. And that's the side that people don't see. They think, well, they can't afford care, so they just shouldn't get care. And it's like, they're going to get the care. Patients will come in and be seen. It's just that, where is that cost being funneled, and where are those resources being used, and can we use them more effectively? And I certainly think that we can. And so, very similar to, other places that have, universal healthcare systems, I'm a big fan of those systems. They are not perfect, of course, but no system is. But any system that at least gives our patients, equal access to healthcare, if I could do it globally, and if I could do it efficiently, quickly, that would probably be the magic wand moment for me. So.
Really interesting insight.
Yeah.
Wish I could give you that magic wand and you can do your thing.
I wish so, yeah.
So you must be a highly organized, efficient person to balance all the different hats that you wear. But what's your biggest time drain at the moment for you?
Oh gosh. First, thank you for believing so highly of me being organized. My biggest time drain is I would say reading and reviewing, and I hate to say it as a drain, like it's not a negative thing, but reading and reviewing and drafting a lot of the work that we discuss when I'm in meetings with some of the, operations team members and things like that. It takes a lot of time to go through all those regulations and to make sure that we're not missing anything, to make sure that we are compliant, of course. I think for some healthcare workers, the word compliance is almost a naughty word, because it invokes, feelings of, oh my gosh, we're not doing something right. And in all honesty, when you really dive into those compliance things, it really kind of shows, it'll also show the strengths of the system as well. But regardless, going through those guidelines, going through the workflows at, different organizations, executing it, coming back and having a meeting about what worked and what didn't, redrafting, of course, because drafting is an ongoing continuum when you're, fine tuning policies. That definitely takes probably the most time of the things that I'm doing right now.
And I'm thinking to the future, where would you love to take your consulting or advocacy work over the next 6 to 12 months? What's on the cards for you?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I would love to just take some of the concepts that I've learned and that I've found with doing individual consulting, and just move it out on a global scale, and understand that there's so many different things that affect workflows and access to care in healthcare. And, we talk over and over again about how in different places healthcare can be a broken system. And I think it's because a lot of times, as a whole, as a unit, companies or even, governmental systems, I think they focus on the wrong things. I think they're not prioritizing the correct things. And so that would be my ultimate goal, would be to just kind of spread that awareness and be able to say, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation with, where your workflow gaps are, where your quality care gaps are, what kinds of things are we seeing that are limiting patients' access to care or contributing to provider or clinical staff, frustration and disillusionment. And let's meet in the middle and let's make that happen. And it's very interesting what I've learned working as a leader in different spaces, that one of the most important things to do is to pay attention to the needs of what the members of your organization need, both the customers or the patients that you're serving, and the people that are helping everything run and flow. And if you don't pay attention to those things, you're going to end up with companies that constantly crank out policies and regs and things like that will just continue to frustrate and not actually accomplish the job that they were set out to do.
Thank you. And if you were starting your career again tomorrow with everything that you now know, would you do anything differently, or would there be a risk that you had taken sooner had you known?
Let me ask for a little bit of additional clarification on that question.
Just thinking, if you were to restart everything tomorrow, whether it be medicine or the law or the other things that you've taken on, I just wonder whether you would have done anything differently with everything that you now know. Would there be perhaps a risk you would have taken sooner? Obviously, hindsight's a wonderful thing. This is a very hypothetical question.
Of course. You know, the one thing that I would have done differently is I would have done a combo program, you know, a medicine law school combo program instead of going back to do it again, because that was a great time to be alive. You know, working full time in the ED and going to school part time, which eventually became full time by the second half of it. But that's what I would do. That's what only thing I would do differently. But knowing what I know now, I still feel like the tools that I've gathered and the knowledge that I've, you know, compounded over the years really allows me to not just exist in a healthcare space, but to really kind of push it to thrive. And I don't know that I would do anything differently in my career from that angle, just because I still want to be able to do that. I would just probably do it a lot sooner when my mind and my body and everything else was young and a little bit more fresh. So yeah, that's probably what I would do differently.
Well, Jarika, with that, I'd like to thank you so much for this conversation. It's been such a powerful and layered conversation.
Awesome.
Thank you for giving us your insights into medicine and also the kind of the legal and operational sides that we don't perhaps understand as clinicians. I think you've really given us some fantastic insights. So I'm very grateful for your time and thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.